the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. How are you, Tim?
I am great. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Well, we got some good news from the state. They announced earlier that thanks to the record rains, farmers are getting 100% of the state's water allocation for the first time since 2006.
Yeah, it should not have been major news. That should have been a given. But it shows you how long we've been having these critical water problems, some of which were related to the drought, but a lot of which, as we've discussed on this podcast before and in our great book by Steve Greenhut, Winning the Water Wars, these are really critical water infrastructure issues that we've kind of fumbled through for too long. So great news for the farmers. And one of the things that you hear them say, is that, not only is this their water allocation for their crops this year, but they're hoping to save a lot of this water because just as we had a big water year this year, we could go back to a drought next year. So I think our farmers are going to be very wise in how they use and store this water. But hopefully this, news of our great water year and all the water that we thankfully tuck in the state, that doesn't diminish the need to get these water storage projects jump-started, get them on track to finally be built. Let's not waste this opportunity because we collected a lot of rain this year, but a lot of it went out to sea because we didn't have sufficient storage and conveyance.
So that leads us to our podcast guest, Pam Lewison, who is our Senior Fellow in Agriculture here at PRI. And we also share her because she's also with the Washington Policy Center in Washington State. So Pam focuses on all of our agricultural issues, especially our water issues. And it's a great treat to have her. What's really wonderful about Pam is she's also a journalist as well as a policy analyst. So she's really great at explaining the weeds, no pun intended.
That's right. And we talk about all these kind of issues with water, but we also talk about animal rights. We talk about Prop 12, which is an issue that we have been following here at PRI, in which the Supreme Court is about to hand down a key ruling in that case. So lots of interesting discussion in both water and agriculture-related policies. So I think you'll all enjoy our chat with Pam.
Thanks so much for listening. And here's Pam Lewison. Pam, we're so pleased to have you back on Next Round to talk about the ongoing challenges facing California farmers as the state's water challenges continue. Last year, at this time, we were talking about how farmers would continue to be able to grow the crops that feed the world with so little water available. This year, farmers have the opposite problem after a year of record rain. As someone with years of farming experience, paint a picture for us. What are California's farmers experiencing today?
So what I think is interesting about last year versus this year in particular is there is kind of such a thing as too much water after you've had basically none for a while. So I'll preface everything I'm going to say with I'm not a hydrologist and I'm not a meteorologist, but I am a lifelong farmer. So what farmers now are dealing with is trying to manage runoff to the best of their ability. And I hope figuring out ways to store the water that they have available to them so that they can use it not just this growing season, but hopefully long-term into next growing season. What we see in particular, and we see it here, I live in a desert region of Washington, is if it's been a long time since you had some sort of water applied and available, you tend to have a lot of that lost through runoff because the soil isn't moist enough to accept more water. So I would imagine that farmers in California are dealing with the same thing. And they're looking at their fields, trying to figure out how they keep that water in place long enough for the soil to get moist enough to absorb that water. It takes a long amount of time to do that. It's not something that happens overnight. It takes, sometimes days, weeks for soil to change enough to accept water. But it also gives you great opportunity to figure out creative solutions for how to store that water long term and figure out even quicker creative solutions on the fly for keeping that water in place. So I would hope to see some berms or temporary structures that are keeping water in a field so that it has time to be of the most benefit.
So you recently wrote that despite all the recent rains and the record snowpack measurements and the increase in state water allocations that farmers are getting, the drought in California is far from over, especially for agriculture. So from your perspective, what are some of the challenges California farmers are going to face water-wise this year and in the coming years? And, what would they see, for example, if, we have this record year of rain followed by one of the drier years that we've seen, that's more common these days?
There's a couple of different things at play in terms of what water recovery looks like and how you sort of bask in having this excess amount of water right at the moment. It's interesting. I was thinking about the questions you all sent to me, and as a kid, because I've been kind of a nerd my whole life, I read a book of historical fiction set in the Imperial Valley. And it talked about this long drought and how farmers and ranchers in California were losing crops and livestock and that sort of thing. And then it rained and everything sort of bloomed over a period of several seasons. But I think that is a great sort of reflection of what you're looking at long term. So short term, again, I would hope that there's some way to sort of corral that water and make sure that reservoirs that are full are being used to their full potential. And then long term, you have to sort of, what I hope or what I envision is something of a you build it and they will come scenario where the state really invests in the infrastructure of building new reservoirs and making sure that as the existing ones drain, they are at their peak potential of capacity and functionality. And I say that because whether we like it or not, by the end of this growing season, theoretically, most of that water is going to be used up in some way. That's how stored surface water works. So what you hope is that while there's existing water, there's also an emphasis on how do we capture more water next year in the event that we have another super wet winter and early spring. I think that's the hope, because then you have the ability to, as a farmer, return to some of those higher value crops that you maybe haven't entertained recently, whether that's, a reintroduction of a short-term berry crop or potatoes, or perhaps you're looking at lettuce and those sorts of vegetables that require a lot of water during their lifespan of growing before harvest. The reverse of that is if we revert back to a dry year next year, I hope that there has been that taking advantage of knowing that water will come again and having an emphasis on how do we continue to cultivate more drought resistant crops? How do we keep food relatively inexpensive when we are talking about having to change maybe eating patterns and growing patterns, and again, revisiting that infrastructure so that you are ensuring that you can take advantage of the good years to help you get through the bad years.
So, Pam, another big water supply issue affecting California farmers has been the ongoing struggle over water allocations between several Western states from the rapidly declining Colorado River. Recently, the Biden administration issued an environmental analysis that represented its first step toward solving the issue. So explain to our listeners why whatever is decided in this dispute will have as an impact on California farmers, and what do you think will ultimately be decided here?
So the Colorado River is the major source of surface water for a huge number of Western states. And its water levels have been in decline for many years because of the drought and because cities keep getting larger. And so there's a municipal pull from that water source as well. What I think is unique about California in that situation is California relies a lot on the Colorado River for water. So whether we're talking about a city needing water or farms needing water, there's a pretty big pull from this surface source that is starting to lessen every year rather than sort of replenish itself because of snowpack and that sort of thing. I think what that means is if your primary source of surface water as a farmer is from the Colorado, it's very likely that even though there's a vast amount of water available right now in the state, you're very likely to still be in a situation where your allotment is curtailed, at least proportionally. And I think ultimately what will happen is, there's going to be a real push to step away from using the Colorado as a primary source of water until such time as it starts to sort of come back to its normal flow level and volume. Whether that takes a year, 2, or 10, I suspect that all of the states that rely on the Colorado are very likely going to have to figure out ways to supplement or change how they get water to replace what they're losing from that particular river.
So one of the biggest changes to water policy in recent years has been the enactment of the very controversial Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which for the first time carved out a role for the state in managing groundwater. Now, groundwater, of course, is a key water supply, both for agriculture and for residents as well for drinking. However, as we saw, not surprisingly, many farmers had to overpump this groundwater on their land to keep growing their crops during the drought. So explain to our listeners how it works for farmers to replenish their groundwater supplies in years of heavy rain like this, and how really a lot of planning and work is involved to replenish these water supplies. And how is this new state law impacting groundwater management across the state?
So there's a great pilot program that is coupled with this new law that effectively empowers farmers to keep some of their larger fields fallow and then creates a connection between reservoirs that are close by and that field. And water is on a sort of timed relief system to flood those fields and then be left to sit there and soak out. The idea being that the soak out over time, that water will migrate down and back into the groundwater system. I think overpumping is a challenging prospect anywhere in the West because groundwater takes a very, very long time to recharge. And as you're waiting for that recharge that can take decades in some cases, you still have to get on with the business of life. In Washington in particular, I think it's interesting because this is one of those rare places where California and Washington diverge pretty greatly. In Washington, if you overpump a well, our Department of Ecology has the ability to come to you and cap your well and say, no more, you have no more water right. You have no more ability to pump groundwater because the priority for water right use in Washington is with the municipalities. So it doesn't matter how old your water right is or what kind of gallons per minute you have associated with it. If you are starting to draw down your neighboring town, city, whatever it might be, you don't have the option to use that well anymore. And they won't let you drill a new one. You're done. You're a dryland farmer. So California, I think, is sort of slowly moving in that direction with this groundwater management program. But I think the idea is to be, hopefully, I hope, less punitive and really look at how can we utilize years like this one where we have an excess amount of water and turn that excess into something that is long. And that's where these selective and timed field floods come in. But it's going to be something that takes again, a really long period of time. And I think more specifically, both farmers and municipalities need to sort of tighten the cinch a little bit about how water gets used, because it is a finite resource, particularly groundwater. So you need to be mindful about, how efficient can we be using it? And, perhaps in municipalities, that means people are incentivized to take out lawns and put in desert landscape, or they're incentivized to do something else, drain that pool and use it for some other collective resource. And I think those are some of the challenges that are going to have to be addressed long term. But I do think this is a decent start toward figuring out what works best for both ag and non-ag folks.
So let's talk about some other policy issues at the state and federal level that could impact California's farmers. First, following up on our discussion of groundwater management, you've written about Assembly Bill 460, legislation being pushed in Sacramento that would punish Californians, including farmers, for, quote, overusing water during the drought. If enacted, how would this bill negatively impact the groundwater management efforts of ag in California? And if not AB 460, what are some of the alternative ways you would recommend state policymakers explore to cut down on wasteful water use without impacting farmers?
So what I think is, I had to revisit AB 460 because it's been a little while since I looked at it. But what I thought was, what stuck out particularly to me is that it makes water overuse a crime. That's not something that I've seen a whole lot in the West, but it imposes some pretty significant penalties, unlike some other places. So, if you are found to be in violation of the law, you have the potential to be fined up to $10,000 a day and $5,000 per acre foot of overuse. And an acre foot is a lot of water. For people who are not familiar with the terminology, an acre foot is 12 inches of water spread across an entire acre. It is a massive amount of water. In fact, to put it in perspective, on my farm, that's 1/3 of my entire allotment for an entire growing season. It's a vast amount of water. It's enough to actually grow agricultural crops. I appreciate the goal, right? The goal is to get people to see that this is the fine that might happen if you go across that line into overuse. But I think in particular, in the case of agriculture, we need to look at what ag already does to mitigate water use, particularly things like the ripping out of annual crops for perennial crops like tree fruit and nuts. Because trees typically, once they hit maturity, use significantly less water. Using drip line irrigation instead of overhead sprinklers or even overhead pivot irrigation, where you have a gap between the ground and your water source, because then you have evaporation loss. For that matter, exploring more drought-resistant crops, or looking not just specifically at drought-resistant crops, but what crops can I grow in the environment I'm in that fit a need but require less water. So, agriculture is doing all of those things proactively and voluntarily already. So I think it's really important to sort of give credit where credit is due. And if you look at the long-term situation with the drought, there were several news stories about who was overusing water in California. And I think one story I found, I think it was out of LA, they listed the top 10 biggest violators of the drought water policy, and they were all sort of famous people. So when you start to think about, those 100,000 gallon swimming pools and those very verdant lawns and those beautiful, but ultimately gardens that don't grow food, they're quite simply there to look at. I think there's an opportunity to really ratchet down on those folks and say, hey, this is supposed to be a community effort. And, if you're a millionaire, a $10,000 a day fine doesn't seem that big. But if you're a regular person, $10,000 a day, has the potential to bankrupt you and make you homeless. So I think there needs to be a little bit more exploration about making sure that every part of the community understands how vitally important it is when there's little amounts of water, or when that water resource is rapidly declining, that it takes everyone to fix it, not just some people. I think, ag in that sense is really low-hanging fruit to take the blame, because we're visible as a water user. That seems superfluous until you talk about the facts, which is that water is being used to produce food, which is something that everyone needs every day. Not everyone needs a beautiful green lawn every day. You're getting no significant survival benefits from it. So there needs to be some trades looked at in terms of what is beneficial water use and what isn't.
Another issue that you've written about is a push by our California Air Resources Board to convert 20% of farms in the state to organic food production by 2045. Now, you make the case that this is another of the type of costly green mandates by CARB that PRI has written extensively about over the years and in this and other areas that really would push more farmers out of business in the state. So explain why this policy would be a bad one for farmers and consumers alike. Isn't agriculture really already doing their part in the fight against global climate change?
So I think I'm going to preface my comments by saying I have no issue with organic farming if there's room in the production space for everyone. But that said, production on my farm is conventional with the goal of having zero residue at the end of it, which is just a fancy way of saying we are really careful about how we apply fertilizer and pesticides so that there is no overuse or extra. So that said, I think anytime you have some sort of grand mandate like this in place, you really have to delve into what it means in a sort of boots on the ground sense. And there are a couple of things that strike me in particular about this mandate toward organic. I think people have this misunderstanding of what it means to grow organic food. Specifically, people think that there's no footprint. And that's just not true. So I think when CARB puts out something like this, what they're saying is we believe this sort of virtue signaling that comes with buying organic produce. But organic produce takes more acreage to grow the same amount of food as conventional farming. Organic produce still has the application of pesticides and fertilizers. And in the case of some pesticides, the application is actually greater. So instead of a one application on my farm, it may take 3 or 4, which is 4 times as much fuel used in a tractor. It's 4 times as much time spent by any number of people to apply that additive or whatever it is you're putting down. And you have 4 times as much of that particular pesticide, fertilizer, whatever it may be, being applied. So I think it's important to think about, what's efficient and what works well, rather than looking at something as being better and more virtuous. And I think particularly about 2 things that often get forgotten in this discussion about organic versus conventional. And the first is that organic food is more expensive. California is one of the states where there are a great many people who are food insecure, despite the fact that fresh produce is readily available 11 to 12 months out of the year, depending on where you are in the state. And organic has a markup of about 30% versus conventional. And you go back to more applications, more use of product, more use of other inputs, and that's where that cost comes from. So it's great if you can afford it, but if you can't, and the push is to slowly make everyone buy organic produce, what you're really doing is telling people with less income or who are food insecure that they are in the category of have-nots. They are people who don't deserve to have fresh produce. They'll have to settle for canned or frozen. Now, canned and frozen produce is not bad. In fact, if that's what you can afford, buy it, because any produce is better than none. But if you have this vast resource of fresh produce available, why would you not want to give it to as many people as you possibly can by making it cost effective and affordable? And then the other portion of that too is we as a culture are very superficial about our food. We want it to look the same and be beautiful and look like something out of a magazine. In fact, that's the reason if you walk into a Whole Foods where you'll be buying organic produce, everything is arranged by color because it looks pleasing visually when you walk in the door. We eat with our eyes first. And traditionally, organic produce isn't the prettiest. It's got knobs and it's funny shaped, or maybe it had to be grown longer, so it's huge to make sure that it got to maturity. And so you have to get over this hurdle of what your food looks like and into what benefit it's providing. And before anybody argues with me about it, there is no nutritional difference between organic produce and conventionally grown produce. So it comes back to not just what's visually pleasing, but what is affordable for every person in the market, every price point, whether you are a millionaire or you're barely making it on minimum wage. Everyone should have produce available to them. So when you have these mandates and you're asking farmers to go through the 3-year conversion process from conventional to organic, you are also asking them to increase their prices by 30% minimum and potentially price an entire population out of the ability to have food, and also price a farm out of the ability to grow food.
I've asked this question again and again to some of my friends. I understand the argument that organic foods, they provide the same nutritional value as conventional foods, but do organic foods taste better? Is that why people buy them or opt for them?
I think that the argument between organic versus conventional, it comes down to a virtue preference. Because there is no significant difference in taste or nutrition. The only difference that we're really talking about here is how it is grown. And I would argue that if you put an organic strawberry and a conventional strawberry to someone in a blind taste test, they could not tell you which is which.
I totally agree.
So I think that the notion that organic is somehow better is really great marketing, but that's all it is.
So, Pam, at the federal level, you've written about Congress's efforts to pare back the Biden administration's overreaching regulations that would expand so-called waters of the United States rules, targeting farmers and other private landowners. Tell us why the Biden administration's efforts here would be problematic for farmers in California and in other states.
So WOTUS is a really interesting and ongoing struggle, I think, in the U.S. in general. So to give it a little background, back during the Obama era, waters of the U.S. became defined as somewhere that was either navigable, meaning you could put a boat in it and tool around in the water, or having a significant nexus to another body of water. Significant nexus is a very subjective term. In fact, the EPA has said effectively anything can be waters of the U.S. with significant nexus applied. So right now, the Supreme Court is deliberating a case of a couple in North Idaho who've been trying to build a house on a piece of property that is across the road and on the other side of a housing development from a lake. And what the EPA has said is that they will not grant them a permit because their property is directly adjacent to a significant nexus of a wetland. The couple argues that there is no standing water on their property, and there are these actual physical structures between their property and the water. In the meantime, while the Supreme Court's figuring out what they want to do and how to interpret waters of the U.S., both the EPA and the White House issued rules for how they are choosing to interpret waters of the U.S. that became effective mid-March, I believe. And what what their rules do is effectively revert back to the Obama era rules where anything is subject to waters of the US. Anything has the potential to be curtailed, whether it's building or putting in a farm or continuing to conduct your farming operation as it currently exists. All of those things would be subject to EPA regulation and oversight. This poses a particular problem in agriculture because a great many parts of agricultural water supply are ephemeral. They come and go. Sometimes we have these ponds that are available in the early spring because of snow melt or some other form of runoff, and they get used for irrigation purposes or for livestock water, perhaps. And then by midsummer, they're gone. Under the current interpretation from the White House and the EPA, that theoretical ephemeral pond has the potential to be deemed waters of the US if it fits the other subjective criteria, meaning significant nexus or a navigable waterway. What I think is interesting about the rules that were issued by the EPA and the White House earlier this year is that they appear to try to circumvent questions in the current Supreme Court case. Congress effectively put out an act of censure and said, we don't agree with this because you are trying to meddle in a Supreme Court case that is ongoing. The president, of course, vetoed that congressional action. What makes this even more interesting or sort of compounds this discussion is Texas, Idaho, and 24 other states all have active injunctions against the current waters of the US rule as they were issued earlier this year. So more than half of the states in the United States are waiting on the Supreme Court ruling before they determine how to apply the waters of the US rules. And, the other less than half are also, I don't want to say that they're waiting, but they have to determine, do we issue interpretations of these new rules now, when potentially anywhere from today to midsummer, we could have to change them? Or do we just wait until the Supreme Court rules? So it's put every water agency in every state in the country in a predicament that they don't want to be in. And, I think the combination of the appearance of meddling in an active court case and returning to such a restrictive interpretation of what constitutes waters of the US poses really potentially long-term consequences as we all move forward in not just this water season, but every water season afterward. So we just have to wait for the Supreme Court to have its say, and hopefully what we come up with is something that's a little bit more palatable for everybody.
Another issue that you've written about extensively is food labeling. And you've written about the confusion over, whether a chicken is cage-free or free-range, but also about the controversy over country of origin labeling. So why, in your view, is labeling so important for agriculture? Is this an issue of a product being properly marketed, or is there something more important at play here?
I think labeling in general is one of those things where everyone wants to put their name on something that they're proud of, whether it's a research paper that I've written or when I was a journalist having a byline. If it's something you're proud of and you've put a lot of work into it, you want people to know that you did it, that it's yours. And so I think there's this long-term and ongoing discussion about not just marketing, but ownership. The United States is one of the safest places in the world for food production. We have so many regulations and so many rules and policies we have to follow as food producers that we want people to embrace. We are people who are abiding by those rules and providing both a readily available and affordable source of food. And it comes down to, we live in a global environment. So what can you do to make your product special? If you are in the wine industry and you live outside of the Champagne region of France, you do not have champagne. You have sparkling wine. And so food labeling of other things falls into that same category. You want to show people that this is a product that you grew and is truly valuable because you grew it. And what I think is unique about the US in particular is we compete on a global food market, but at the same time, we really value local customers. So, and we see that in particular bubble up during the lockdowns during COVID, because, grocery stores were a little sparse, and people were trying to find other ways to source food. And what better way to do it than your neighbor down the road who, has a berry patch or has, 13 chickens, or, pick your thing. So it became, in that era, it became about intimacy with your food product and having it readily available. And I think that's something that we're going to carry on and continue, is this desire to have a better knowledge of where our food comes from, and how to do that in an easy way for the vast majority of customers, because less than 1% of the nation is involved directly in food production, is to have a label on it. Now, whether that's, if you come to my farm, you'll get a hat. If you buy hay from us, you get a hat with our logo on it as a thank you for spending money with us. But also, that's our label. It's really hard to put a label on a bale of hay, so we put it on a ball cap and give it to our customers. But if you're a produce grower, or you are a meat producer, it becomes making sure that there's some sort of sticker, label, identifier on that package in the grocery store that tells people, hey, someone you potentially know produced this for you. So there's a lot to unpack about how we label and whether it meets the criteria for the World Trade Organization and USTR. But I think as we continue forward, and as fewer and fewer people are directly involved in food production, labeling is going to continue to be something that's really important.
Finally, Pam, let's talk about California's Prop 12, which sets the requirements for the space needed to raise pigs in order to sell the pork products to California. We're all pretty anxious awaiting the decision from the Supreme Court, in this case, challenging its constitutionality. So based on your read of the case, how do you think the court will ultimately come down? And what would it mean for the production of pork products in the United States if the court upholds the law?
So what I hope, I'm very hopeful in this podcast today, but what I hope is that the Supreme Court rules in favor of the Dormant Commerce Clause and says, no, you cannot impose rules on producers outside of your state, at least not rules that are mandated, because Prop 12 does just that. It says, if you want to bring a pork product into the state of California, regardless of where that hog is raised, you must follow our production protocol. The Dormant Commerce Clause clearly says states cannot regulate other states in any aspect of production of food, of manufacturing, of transportation, of anything else. So, if other states want to comply with that, that's their choice. But it should be a choice. Prop 12 would make it a requirement. So you sort of have two options if Prop 12 is upheld. The first is if you're a hog grower in, say, Illinois, you decide that you're not going to follow the rules of Prop 12. And then you have to notify your processor and the company that you have a contract with for your pork products. And they will have to determine whether or not they still want to employ you as a producer of pork. And they can say, yes, we will. We just have to earmark this as not a California approved product. Or they will say, well, then you no longer grow hogs for us. You're going to have to find another line of work. Now, that seems really extreme, particularly given that California consumes, I think it's right around 12% of all pork production in the US. So very minimal, really. And yet, it is a real thing to consider. that some hog producers are going to say, I can't afford the retrofitting necessary for this, or I don't believe in this because it exposes my hogs to greater risk of, veterinary infection or more violence between themselves, because hogs are notoriously aggressive. And if they don't want to do that, they are looking down the barrel of whether or not they are continuing to be hog farmers. I hope that, that the Commerce Clause is upheld. I think there's a good case that the Commerce Clause should be upheld. But also, if Prop 12 is upheld instead, the other sort of long-term consequence that you can see developing over time is states developing these sort of punitive farming practice laws that have to be applied to everyone else. Prop 12 has to be applied to every state in the country for hogs to go into California. You could see where Iowa would maybe say, well, you're going to have to follow our rules for beef production or the production of fresh produce. Otherwise, you can't send it. And so you kind of have the potential to set up this tit for tat lawmaking that goes back and forth where, hopefully not, but in the current political environment we're in, it's certainly easy enough to see where there would be a sort of one-upsmanship of how can I make this more restrictive and more beneficial only to the people within the confines of my state boundaries. And as you look at it from that perspective, I think it's a really dangerous precedent to set, to uphold Prop 12 as something to be followed through with. And I genuinely hope that the Supreme Court rules in favor of the Dormant Commerce Clause.
Thanks so much, Pam. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.